Hello there. I'm Geraldine Doogue and welcome to day 2 of this International Education Summit brought to you by the Australian Technology Network of Universities. I'm very pleased you could join us, and I do hope you agree that the method of connection forced upon us is actually making all sorts of things possible, and I feel quite sure that the descendants of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, on whose ancestral land I sit here at the UTS in Sydney, would approve, and I pay them my respects. Now, yesterday we focused on what I think is fair to say you could consider the underappreciated impacts, economic impacts of international education and its job-creating capacities and its the role it played in economic growth and all the flow-on effects. Although I was struck anyway, I don't know how many of you were who were with us yesterday, about how the question of values and Australian values of hospitality and of responsibility to people who choose to take part in our lives, how that also emerged to the fore more than I sort of imagined it might. In fact, if anything, I thought it was the impact on the communities within the within Australia that as much as the impact on the students themselves of COVID, that was a very interesting theme of yesterday, and it'll be interesting to see if that element emerges today. Now, we're going to have 2 sessions. The first, the state and sector perspectives, and the second session, the position of international education in this time of big tensions, geopolitical tensions, particularly in our region as tectonic plates shift, as it's often referred to, bit cliched, but as different countries really jostle for power, and it's become extremely willing, as I think you must have noticed. First, though, I'd like to welcome Luke Sheehy, who is the ATN Executive Director, for some reflections on yesterday before we advance further. Hi there, Luke.
Hi, Geraldine, and thank you so much for being involved in this summit. And I'm delighted that the Australian Technology Network of Universities, Curtin University in Perth, University of South Australia in Adelaide, RMIT in Melbourne and University of Technology Sydney are joining with our friends, the University of Newcastle and Deakin University, to present this wonderful summit. I thought yesterday was a really great discussion about how international education has been a great transformer of the Australian economy. But as you rightly said, it transforms our communities, and that's both in terms of in our big cities, but in our regional cities and towns. And we heard, thanks so much to Gillian. I'm going to read them out so I don't get it wrong. Gillian, Bob, Lord Mayor Sally Capp, Stephen and Megan yesterday in the first session. And I really was struck by that remark by Lord Mayor Sally Capp, where she said, when international students are here in our city or in our communities, we are their family. And I thought that's just a wonderful recognition of the wonderful contribution that international students make to the to Australian community when they're here. And then also in our second session with Ted Baillieu, John Hart, Kim Curtin and Ellen Duncan, just how important the economic strategy is to continue this wonderful sector. So we have this kind of amazing amalgamation of, it enriches our society, but of course it helps map out a stronger future for our economy. So it was great to hear those stories and those perspectives from yesterday. And today's session will be slightly different. We'll hear from me and others in the sector, of course, and those geopolitical issues this afternoon, which I'm looking forward to listening to. So it was a great first day. We had nearly 300 people tuning in from across Australia and internationally. So I'm looking forward to today, and thank you very much, Geraldine, and all of our participants in the summit.
No, well, thank you, Luke, and I will introduce you in this next session, but I'm also learning a lot, I might add, and expect to see aspects of it, hear in particular aspects of it. So, look, thank you very much. So now the session we're going to go into now is quite interesting. It's both theoretical and practical in a way, because I think that was what was good about yesterday. It was very applied. It's an opportunity for 2 states, New South Wales and South Australia, to speak to us, who've thought through the process of coordinating a case to go to National Cabinet for pilots of international students to return or to start their study. And to let us hear the way they workshopped the economic arguments, I think South Australia, UTS and University of Newcastle have been particularly prominent in these considerations. So I'm going to repeat the format I did yesterday, where I'll introduce our 5 guests as we go, so you don't have a whole blast of sort of names and titles. And I'll pose a central question to everybody so that you can hear their overall thoughts, then we'll drill a bit deeper. And I'm going to read 2 parts from the IEAA blog of August the 11th, which I was given as part of preparing for this, because they certainly arrested me, and I think it's a good backdrop to go into this. So this is what it said. Now more than ever, we need the federal government to support states and territories who wish to go ahead with the, quotes, secure corridor framework, despite domestic borders being closed. The latest data shows there were 60,870 deferments as of May 2020, 45,597 more than in the same period in 2019. With Canada considering a return of international students from September and other countries already open, we need to action the plan to welcome back continuing international students from a range of destinations, or the sector may never fully recover. Our students will not defer indefinitely. So that was a bit bracing. And I've tried not to, in this, go to the sort of full-on horror situations, to be a little bit more constructive, but you have to hear that, I think. So this is the question I want everybody whom I introduce to just answer at the top, and then we'll go deeper. What is your key solution that you propose or you think ought to be on the table for people to start digesting? Now, I'm going to go first to Peter Mackey. Peter has had a lot of experience in the Australian education and training sector. He worked for Austrade for over 4 years, including in Hanoi and Singapore. And he's worked closely with New South Wales government departments. He's currently Director of Trade, International Education and Small Business Operations within New South Wales Treasury. And we also tapped that group yesterday as well. So Peter, how would you answer that question?
Hi, Geraldine. You can hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Look, firstly, I should say that we don't actually have a formal proposal before the Commonwealth Government to secure secure a plan to get international students back on a pilot. But I can say that going back to May, the position of the New South Wales Government was really about trying to get students back at scale as being the best mechanism to try and restore confidence in the sector and to be able to support the sector to do what it does best. So we were on a pathway, and as you say, UTS was at the forefront of that in terms of supporting us in that plan. We formed a task force very quickly that had New South Wales Police and New South Wales Health and all of the key entities. We met at the Police Operations Centre on a number of occasions throughout May and June. And I guess the position here was that the pilot was not necessary because we had a system that was very robust and was working very effectively to bring people back into the state through airport quarantine in large hotels, CBD-based hotels, and to this point, touch wood, that continues to be the case. And then, unfortunately, matters took a turn for worse in Victoria, and then the immediate impact to Sydney Airport meant that that was not possible because we just had such limited capacity. So that's been put on the back burner, and obviously the health response was the Premier's primary priority, and that continues to be the case. But I think to answer your question, really, the best way to try and restore confidence is to be able to find a mechanism to get the students back here as quickly as possible as we can, and ideally this year, because I think Vietnam and about 5 or 6 other countries are about to open up their borders to each other under a bubble, and the concern is that we're going to be left behind, and reputationally we are not going to be in a position to be able to secure the students for 2021, which is obviously the most crucial thing for the sector at the moment.
Yeah, I'll come back because John Hart from Tourism Australia yesterday had some very interesting things to say about precisely that. Okay, let's go to Jane Lee, who's IDP's Country Director of Student Services within Australia. And prior to that, she was Manager of Marketing Admissions at the University of Ballarat. So Jane, what would you say as something, key thing that needs to happen?
The So I would like to first to share some statistics to start with. So basically, IDP conducted a survey back in April and June with over 4,000 international students who have had an offer letter on hand with universities across NZ, Canada, UK, and the US. And that research shows that students are still holding on to their overseas study goals. What they need is practical and pragmatic support from industry and the government. Over 74% of the students we surveyed are still planning on commencing their study as planned. So there's still hope for us as a sector. And over 41% of students that we surveyed for Australia are happy to commence online and transition to face-to-face. And this shows our students really understand the challenge. And
what percentage did you say? What percentage was that?
41%.
Oh, right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 41% of the students we surveyed for Australia destination in particular, they are happy to commence online and transition to face-to-face study. So this, again, just shows that really they understand the challenges facing their study journey and the overall sector, and they're willing to compromise. And globally, over 77% of the students are willing to quarantine. It means they can commence the on-campus study sooner. That means if we can open the border for them, they are willing to come, and they're willing to quarantine. And the research also shows that any commitment to providing health care, accommodation, and travel are likely to help us convert those students. Now, here's the thing. That's the urgency of getting this out to the student. Then there's a window for us to act. The student says they would largely hold on to their goals for about a year.
Oh.
They change their plans. So this is a really interesting snapshot. So to answer your question, Geraldine, what needs to happen? What needs to happen quickly? I think first of all, we do really need to address students' need for that practical, pragmatic support from the industry and the government. So obviously now we're looking to rolling out the Safe Corridor program, the pilot program. So students need clarity around, how this is going to work. And when it's going to be rolled out to the other states, because we know that at the moment South Australia and Northern Territory are the pioneer states in this space. Now, when that's going to be rolled out to the other states, how the quarantine is going to work, and how they're going to be supported through this transition, and on arrival, they need details. And with the details, this will help the sector to build a confidence with the students. Also, second is quite importantly, is that support from the federal government, and to work collectively with the sector, with the institutions, to build that confidence, in front of international students, to really let them know that the country welcomes them, and it will do whatever we can to help them come here and help them to commence the study in Australia.
Okay.
So.
Right. Look, that might be enough just for now, because that's very, very interesting indeed, Jane. And I'll come back and respond to a couple of those things that certainly provoked me to think. Now, Luke, who we heard from Luke as an overview, Luke is used to advising politicians. He was formerly Senior Policy Advisor to the Minister for Tertiary Education and Shadow Minister for Education and Training, and very much, I think, involved, if I look at his CV, in institutional responses to things. So, Luke, what is achievable and what ought to be achievable? I will ask it to you like that.
Yeah, Geraldine, that's a really good point. And I think primarily what we've been looking at in the sector is how can we ensure that we get students here when the health authorities advise us it's safe to do so. And of course, we have to acknowledge that there are around 25,000 Australians wanting to come home as well. So it's a complicated issue for us as a country. But I think what's been really important has been that coordination between the sector, state and territory governments, and of course the Commonwealth government. we worked hard to get some changes to the student visa arrangements, including allowing for our students to commence their studies online. And that's been really important because we can start the students online, and as soon as they can come into Australia, we know that the visa arrangements will flow on and they can continue their studies face-to-face, of course, when we can get them back. I think the other important thing for us to acknowledge is one of our sector advantages in Australia is the opportunity for students to work while they study and, of course, work after they graduate. And that's a terribly important part of Australia's offering to international students and their families. And that combined with the fact we're a really safe and welcoming place. So I think once we've already established quite clearly that Australia, compared to many other countries, is dealing with the COVID pandemic unbelievably well. And of course, a shout out to my Melbourne family and friends who are hanging in there for the last couple of weeks of stage 4 lockdown. But we're very confident that we'll see you all soon, and we'll open up our whole country as soon as we can and get those Australians back and then get students back on shore. It's really important for students to have an experience on campus. Campuses provide laboratories, they provide opportunities for collaboration, they provide services for students, and they often provide housing as well. So we need to look at a way to get them in, but we have to do that in collaboration with the Commonwealth Government, with airlines, with the state governments, and look at hotel quarantining or quarantining arrangements that are safe for students and the community. So it's a big undertaking. But I think we've got some of the policy settings, or at least the policy discussions right. The Commonwealth has, and I think I refer to Minister Tian's interview on Radio National Breakfast this week, where he talks about he's going to need to provide support for the sector, and particularly universities, but also other education providers in 2021. And looking at those key issues of how we bring people in an orderly, safe way, bring back into Australia. If you think about it, if you're a PhD student and you've been in Australia a number of years, you've got a strong connection to Australia. Your networks are here, your relationships and friends are here. It must be very, very difficult for a number of students to not be able to come back into Australia and resume what they consider normal life. So we're working with our students, and we have been since the 1st of February, particularly those students from China, when the travel restrictions were put in place by the Prime Minister. So we've been reaching out with our students, using our capacity to deliver online services. And I think that's a great tribute to our academics and our teaching and learning experts, that in a short period of time, consider the ATN universities plus Deakin and Newcastle, that's nearly 300,000 students who are almost being delivered entirely online. Now, many people would say that's a 5 to 10 year reform change process that would go through in a university, but we've done that in 6 months. And the people have worked day and night to make sure that the student experience is at the forefront of their minds when they're designing those experiences. So there's been a whole range of things that we're doing both internally and of course externally, talking to our friends and partners in government. And I think it's a tribute to state governments for the the step up that they've shown in this period, providing hardship funds for students. Of course, those hardship funds have been made available right across our 6 universities. And many of those hardship funds have been created through donations from staff, which I think is a wonderful thing.
Really?
To know that commitment that we have from our staff to international students. And of course, domestic students. I mean, so many people are doing it tough with the restrictions put in place during this pandemic. So there are lots and lots of things. I could talk about it all day, but I think it's a great tribute to the cooperation that we see between the states and territories and the Commonwealth Government, the leadership, the step up into the leadership space we're seeing, particularly from state governments, and I think the agility and the hard work from our higher education providers to make sure that our students feel included, even if they're in an online environment, which of course many of our students are right now.
All right, well, look, I'm going to come back to that. And am I right that we don't have Mr. Reaburn, Tali Reaburn from South Australia?
No, I'm online, Geraldine. I did manage to sort out my technical problem, so a real pleasure to be with you today.
I wasn't sure. So, well, look, because I wanted you to be there because the South Australian perspective is very interesting indeed. It's very much a leader. Tali Reaburn has worked for various Victorian departments in the past, but he's now the Director of International Education and Tourism within South Australia's Department of Trade and Investment. So how would you, given that you have, as I understand it, tell me if I'm wrong, really been at the forefront of this, tell us practically, what do you think needs to happen now in a solution approach?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question, one we have to keep coming back to. have to remind people, I guess, one, that we're in a global pandemic, so nothing is ordinary. So anything that we can do to, I guess, benefit the sector, everyone's going through independent and individual challenges within what is a pretty fluid environment, including the students themselves. And you know, we're speaking to a number of students internationally who are suffering, you know, really unique challenges in regards to their entire careers, their qualifications, their personal situations. So we have to remember the lived experience of those students as well. Certainly here in South Australia, we've been very lucky. I think a slightly smaller jurisdiction in regards to the numbers of international students and the size of the sector has made it a little easier for us to be a little bit more agile in regards to making sure we're getting the perspectives of the institutions. And I should give a bit of a shout out to the University of South Australia and the work they've been doing, not just around the support for international students, but in regards to bringing forward plans and ideas around how we can start to reopen the sector. That includes borders, but also begin to deliver different services online. I think the challenge from a government point of view is how significant is the impact on the sector going to be from a structural point of view. We know that looking back, you know, the model was that students would travel to Australia to undertake their study. Is that model still viable in the same way, and will it continue to be viable in, I guess, a new world situation? And so on one hand, we're looking at new models, and that includes online significantly, but also looking at ways that students can, I guess, join a runway into getting back to South Australia. And you know, the pilot programs that all states and territories have been working on is one component of that only. I think we're going to also see different international relations with certain markets around COVID as well.
Just tell us a little bit more about this pilot. How well developed is this?
Sorry, Geraldine, I think there's a mute there. I just can't hear you.
I don't think I'm muted. No, I don't think I'm muted. Can you hear me now? Not yet? No? Well, I might just... Pardon?
I can hear you.
Okay, so it's something to do with... I might come back to him then, and we'll go to Craig Robertson, who's he is the CEO of Taliessin Australia. I'm really looking forward to hearing how Craig sees it, very much having sort of cut his teeth in the Victorian bureaucracy, or certainly had a lot to do with the Victorian bureaucracy, and with vocational education, and as well as interacting with universities. So, Craig, how do you see it as in terms of moving forward usefully?
Thanks, Geraldine. And look, I should preface my comments that the TAFEs in Australia have quite a small number of international students. Per TAFE, they're quite significant, but they're certainly not in the numbers that are in universities, nor in the private vet sector. I see it as a two-stage thing, and I reckon we're pretty close to be able to kick this off. I think the first thing is we've got to get the confidence of the Australian people about a social licence to operate. And I think there now needs to be, if we think now that Victoria's sort of a little bit under control now and they can sort of see an end point, I think it's actually time now for our politicians to say, we've conquered this, we've still got challenges, but now we need to be able to think about trying to open up our borders in a particular way, similar to what John Hart was saying yesterday. The problem that we've probably got in the TAFE world is it's the universities can quite readily organise themselves and sort out the safe passage and all of that sort of element. But there is a diverse range of providers that provide services to international students. I do wonder whether the Commonwealth could show a little bit of leadership and say, almost endorse hotel quarantine, and all that sort of stuff, so that individuals could come through. Smaller institutions that can't afford to say, I'm going to pay for the chartering of a plane and all that sort of stuff. They can sort of say, well, this is endorsed quarantining arrangements with hotels, etc., etc. In other words, try to marketise in some way those services, and it won't be wasted because we're going to have to be able to do that more broadly for the next 6 to 12 months until we're pretty sure that there's a vaccine.
Vaccine.
So, yeah. And I think that would then help to, and I'm sure there would be hotels and processes that would open up and and facilitate that. And it
Do
would
you,
allow...
Craig, can I cut through? Do you mean, when you say marketise, you mean that, do you mean subsidies or from the federal government, or do you mean that there becomes almost like a new business opportunity for certain groups to say, well, we are the quarantine providers, and make it more clear? Is that what you mean?
Yes, that's what I'm saying. Now, it would be fantastic if the government could subsidise, and I think, in fact, if we do think that international education is an important part of our educational economic fabric, maybe there is some time that we need to think through about some level of subsidy. But equally, they could come through and endorse, certify, or whatever you want to be able to call it, these sorts of providers, so that the community can be satisfied that there is a quality assured process coming to Australia. Yeah.
So you think at the moment it's too haphazard, and that is not geared to win the confidence of the Australian people, which you...
well, it's a little bit like that, but it's also, it's favouring, not by design, but it is the big end of town. It's the universities that can afford to gather all of their resources and to be able to pay for it with volume, which is fine. That's not a problem at all. Is there some way that we could spread that model out a bit? And that's sort of what I'm trying to think through.
Yeah, I see. Okay, excellent. All right. Well, look, that's very interesting. Now, I'm going to go back because I'm intrigued by Luke sounding so positive about what has occurred. And yet I have to say that my impression looking on doesn't feel like that. So that mobilisation that you're describing, Luke, within the sector, and you implied sort of interacting with the authorities as well, it doesn't, I don't think that's been transmitted to the Australian people. I think it all looks like it's stalled and a bit in paralysis. That's not your experience, isn't it?
Well, yeah, look, I think it's really interesting that Craig describes us as a big end of town, Craig. We are non-profit public institutions that serve a mission to benefit Australian society. But thank you for that. While you're sitting in front of 50 Marcus Clark, you look like the big end of town, Craig. But I will say this, is that I think the Victorian COVID community transfer rates did stall the conversation that we had, and that's right. That is the right thing to do, because we need to focus on how we get our own house in order, ensure the safety of our own communities before we engage in this discussion with the broader community about that social licence that Craig talked about. I mean, but I'll refer to Simon Birmingham's opening remarks yesterday. Very positive, understanding right throughout government about the need for this sector. This sector is it is a massive job creator. In fact, it's probably the biggest job creator in Australia. So we need to do a couple of things. We need to make sure that Australians feel confident that they are safe from COVID community transmission and infection. We can get our state borders open and moving around. I know us here in Canberra, we're quite delighted that we've started to be given permission to move to South Australia and Queensland for a short term in the last couple of weeks. But we need to get that community confidence around COVID first. So of course, Victorian situation did dampen that discussion and that kind of natural trajectory where we're thinking we'll start to get a flow of students back sooner rather than later. So that is right, Geraldine, but I think it's still important that once we get those settings right for Australians, then we can engage in a robust and a renewed conversation with Australians about the value of this important sector, not just for universities, not just for TAFEs, but to grow our cities, to grow our regions, to grow jobs in hospitality and tourism. Now, if we get that right, I think it'll be a compelling argument to both Commonwealth and the state governments to look at an orderly, confident, health-orientated way to bring those students back into Australia. And I'll just jump in on one more thing that Craig said is, I would be quite concerned if universities took the role of quarantining on campus. I think we need to make sure that there is a strong, almost universal application of quarantining for both Australians and visitors when we finally get that up and running. And of course, I think there is opportunity for some entrepreneurs and others in the sector to look at how they might do that in a robust way. Not every university has enough accommodation on campus to do that, nor do TAFEs, as you know rightly, Craig, and some of our smaller providers. So we'd be looking to see how we do that in collaboration with the hotel industry. And I know that in South Australia, it's a really great way to revitalise your hotel industry and those empty hotels in Adelaide to get people and students back into them and quarantining. So I think there's, you know, as we saw yesterday, multiple sectors are involved in this, but we need to get that confidence in the Australian community about COVID transmission rates. And then we need to have a really strong renewed discussion about how this sector is going to grow jobs and opportunity right across the economy. Okay,
does anybody else want to come in on that in terms of how just the sequence, I suppose, because this has become quite interesting yesterday. John Hart was very interesting from Tourism Australia on the importance of getting that sequence right, which Luke's just outlined. But he did say he thought it had to happen before the end of this year. There had to be some clear move, otherwise he was concerned, very concerned. Now he was speaking in the broader tourism level. But Peter Mackey, I just wonder whether you have any, you know, do you think timing is of the essence? Because Jane's implied it's not quite, but I'll come back to her in a moment. But I just wonder what you think.
Oh, look, I think it is. I actually just wanted to comment on support what Luke was just saying there. In New South Wales Police have made it clear that they would not support any other form of quarantine. And the reason for that is because having people in very large, geographically closely located hotels in the CBD means that they can easily move resources around, and it doesn't matter whether there's 20 people or 2,000 people that they're supporting. They would not be able to manage if those quarantine facilities were geographically dispersed. So for New South Wales anyway, that's not something that is going to be considered. But look, I absolutely think timing is critical here. We've got to restore confidence, and we've just got to try and do it. So we do have a plan sitting there ready to put to the Commonwealth as soon as the Premier is comfortable that the health situation is such that and also obviously the capacity at Sydney Airport is such that we can consider bringing people in, acknowledging what Luke said before around social licence when we've got so many stranded Australians offshore, which is clearly the political challenge for all of us at the moment.
Well, is it? Is that? I mean, I think this is very interesting. So so obviously you're all juggling this social license story, and I mean, I'm watching daily. You can see. So that your judgment is that those 25,000 Australians are more of a spur than the possibility of this whole industry being put at some risk.
Oh, I think it's just one of the factors that all of the leaders are taking into consideration. And bear in mind, I think it's 25,000 people that have registered with DFAT, but there's probably figures closer to 100,000 people out there who would come home if they could, if the flights were available. I mean, we have a real challenge in Sydney with the pressure on Sydney Airport. So it's absolutely one of the factors I think that's obviously under consideration here in terms of how the public would perceive prioritising students coming in before those terrible heartache stories that we see every day on the news of families wanting to get back to their loved ones. So it's certainly one of the factors. It's not the only one, but I'm sure it's one.
Oh, that's very, very interesting. Jane, that's given what you were saying about students' readiness to wait a bit, before they change their minds. Anyway, if I heard you correctly, that is. I just want you to develop that a little bit more about because what is becoming clear is we're going to start meeting really big competition, particularly Canada, opening up in September. The Germans are also there, let alone the UK and the US. There is that sense anyway that we're not going to be able to rest on our laurels. You can't see any big movement in students' attitudes yet?
Well, first of all, I do want to clarify that despite the students say they can possibly wait for another 12 months before they change their plan, and exactly as you described, the pressure is actually coming from the other destination countries. And we clearly see some first mover advantages, as you described, Canada and UK, that they remain very committed to allowing students to enter into their country for their foreign intake. And we're certainly expecting increased competition for us for our upcoming January intake from the Northern Hemisphere destinations. So what I want to point out is at the moment we do need to make sure students are crossed in terms of what is being planned.
Right.
It needs to be very, very clearly communicated to our international students who are anxiously waiting from their home countries to when the border is going to be open. Even though we don't have a concrete plan, we need to let them know there's intention and we're working on it. And that message needs to be very, very strong because, you know, the competition is just around the corner. September is literally this month. We're seeing some, you know, feedback from students went to UK already, and that's already stimulated some increased interest. So we do need to act on this quickly.
Now, in fact, Luke, I noticed that George Megalogenis wrote back in May, just thinking of exactly what Jane's just said, that the Morrison government is quietly laying the groundwork to reopen the borders to international students, even as it refuses to offer a lifeline to universities during the lockdowns, part of a 3-step plan to a COVID-safe economy, which that is a very interesting quinella of attitudes, I suppose, there. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Not a great deal, Geraldine. I think what we've had is really strong indication that from Minister Team that the government will have to look at the support for the sector, both in terms of underwriting us financially in 2021, and of course, he'll have further announcements, I think, on other issues like research in the budget. But in terms of bringing back students, I am quite confident that the Commonwealth is thinking about that. And of course, they are being influenced by those terrific advocates for us in the state governments at the national cabinet level. So I think there's a very strong coordinated cross-government emphasis on how to bring back those students. But there's a political reality as well. And you saw only last week the Leader of the Opposition, Anthony Albanese, asking the Prime Minister to bring back Australians on the VIP jets, the government jets. So there will be a prioritising of Australians, I think. But I think it's pretty easy to say, well, if we can bring 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 back a week, depending on whether or not we can get Melbourne Airport and other airports online and the various hotel quarantining systems up, surely we can bring a combination of Australians returning and international students in a really orderly way. But what I would say this is, with Australians as always the #1 priority for an Australian government, international students returning is a huge economic imperative for the Commonwealth and of course for the states and territories is going to be the next cab off the rank, I think. Well, I'm very hopeful that will be the case. So let's wait and see. And I'm sure the government's working through that in a slow and considered process. I think what
Jane's point is about the clarity, even in the provisional plans, matters.
Yeah. I think what 2020 showed us, though, is it can be unpredictable. And of course, Victorian community transmission rates did throw a spanner in the works, so to speak, in the way that we can think about revitalising the international education sector. So we have to be cautious and considered and patient and work through all those processes. I haven't had time to read or see what came out of Jane Holton's review of quarantining at the Commonwealth level. Of course, we've got the inquiry down in Victoria and some of the issues that they would have come across there. So we want to make sure that that process is robust, because that's going to be, again, back to the point about social licence. If there's confidence in quarantining that maintains the safety and confidence in the Australian people at home, then that's when we really can start bringing students back at a level that will be to the point that can start revitalising our sector again.
And Tali, in South Australia, given that you alluded to just how active the South Australian government has been, just that perception of being welcome, because what emerged yesterday, and it is in the literature, is the costs of education, the safety. That will be something that we have going for us, that we have managed the epidemic well, but the sense of students being really told they are welcome. Now, that you think has been tackled particularly well in your plans in South Australia?
Yeah, look, I think this is critical. I mean, and I think as Luke and Peter and the others have all referred to, there's a social licence element, but there's also a social licence element for the international students, in the sense that they're currently sort of locked out from returning back to their own locations. And they need support to be able to deal with that in the same way that Australians locked out or people on border communities have been impacted by border changes as well. I think South Australia has done a really good job on this. I think we acknowledged it very early that there were unique supports needed for international students. I think we were the first state to have a dedicated international student support package, which was a great move. But we've been lucky as well in the sense that we have Study Adelaide, which is I guess a student-facing body which takes full responsibility for that broader student experience. And they worked with international students very early on in the piece to make sure that their sort of student ambassador program was engaging with international students despite them not being here, that those sort of lived student experience stories were still getting out to people, and that there was a sense that there were a whole section of the community here who was supporting students. And that's everything from, you know, the rental changes we made through to the community groups that were bringing students together, and the support that the universities and the other institutions did. One of our vocational institutions here, which was in hospitality and tourism, they actually opened up their commercial kitchen and was cooking hundreds of meals for international students every day. So you had,
and you got that
students,
story out, did you?
Yeah, so those sorts of elements I think really created an environment where students, one, they know that they can get support if they need it. They know that they've got broad support at the government level, which is a really important signal for them, and an important signal to their families back home, who obviously are worried about their sons and daughters, you know, stuck in Australia, but also a really good foundation for welcoming students when we can bring them back physically. So yeah, I think it's a really important element, and it just can't be understated.
I noticed that just getting to whether there need to be a sort of a different type of a plan involved. Dr. Bernard Rinn, who's the chief economist from KPMG, talking about overseas students, if given a clearer pathway to residency, would be a means to achieving that end of actually boosting GDP by additional skilled working age migrants. Extra incentives will be needed to make them choose Australia, as post-COVID-19 world competition for international students will be intense. So we propose an accelerated and targeted intake program. Now, I don't know, Craig, whether that affects, I just thought that might have actually gone to the TAFEs more than some of the other programs, and whether you're thinking about specific changes in the model that you put to government?
In terms of post-study work rights, yes, for example. So yes, post-study work rights work in the higher education sector quite well, because we do know in labour market demand, it's the paraprofessionals, professionals that are in high demand in Australia. Even though the output through universities is pretty high, it's still not enough to satisfy the labour market. So I think that's a valid sort of strategy. We would like to be able to see some post-study work rights for people who come through and do a technical qualification. They're not in the mix at the moment. But of course, this comes back to the social licence to operate. It'd be a little bit difficult if that scene is taking the job off in Australia. So I think what we've got to do is to say, we're guaranteeing and shoring up what we're doing for Australians in terms of transitioning out of a displaced situation into work rights, get the confidence of the public, and then I think we could then look at post-study work rights, particularly out of the TAFE sector or out of the vet sector.
Yeah, right. So you're all, it's quite interesting how delicate you all think this is. So I'm really taking that on board. Peter Mackey, there's another very clear observation made by a range of observers is that it's going to be multiple stakeholders who are going to have to get involved in this next phase, not just the universities, for instance, or to that extent the TAFEs. It's only through the efforts of everyone that we can ensure, this is Melbourne in particular is feeling this, and we heard the particular stories from Melbourne yesterday, remains a globally significant student city following the crisis, and Australia remains a desirable destination for international students. Particular importance will be encouraging more private sector organisations to offer work experience and job opportunities to international students. Now, I just wonder whether you've seen evidence of this sort of thinking in New South Wales, and is this part of the Yes, again, the sort of crisis-driven, fresh thinking that you think has to operate.
Yep, absolutely, Julie. I mean, I think one of the main reasons we know students are attracted to come to New South Wales is the size of the economy, you know, the nature of Sydney being, you know, the business hub, the financial services hub, and so on. So the key thing for us in terms of our work with international students is, because we've got the policy settings in place whereby they can work, we have to make sure that the reality matches the perception prior to them coming here. Because if that's not the case, then, you know, we're doing more harm than good. And you know, students working at McDonald's or whatever is not the kind of experiences that they're looking for. They're looking for meaningful work-related experiences that reflect the areas of study and what their future career objectives are. So we've approached that here by having an international student business charter. So we work with the business community, not only just to sort of at a very basic level highlight to them what the policy settings are, because we find there's a lot of misunderstanding in the business community around the fact that students do have the right to live and work in Australia during and after study, but also for them to understand what the benefits are to their businesses. And I think we're seeing that.
Getting somewhere?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, it's, you know, you chip away, but I think once you start telling the stories, I mean, obviously the benefits to the student are clear, but once you start hearing business people hearing from other business people about what those benefits are, then I think that's where the penny starts to drop. And Stephen Cartwright, the chair of the New South Wales Business Chamber, is the chair of our advisory board. So he's been incredible in terms of getting that word out. What we're trying to do now, and obviously clearly, you know, COVID's been a challenge for that, but once the students do come back, is trying to help. We find regional communities in Australia are often very embracing of international students because they're often communities in major transition. So I think trying to sort of help business people understand, you know, if you look at, say, you know, tourism companies, for example, seeing the benefits that international students can bring in terms of those perceptions of international markets is really hard to overstate. So I think absolutely it's really critical, and we've got to make sure that we're well prepared for when the students do come back, so that businesses can see international students being a part of their recovery phase, taking on board what Craig's talking about in terms of perceptions of students taking work of Australians at a time when unemployment's going to be high.
Yeah, actually, what is the rate, Luke? Remind me, I don't know whether you've got the statistics, I've read them, but I can't remember, of what the general rate is of students who stay and work versus those who go home at the end of their courses?
Look, Luke or others might have the numbers, but I know that the overwhelming majority of students do return home eventually.
Yes.
But yeah, Luke, I'm not sure if you've got any stats, national stats.
No, yeah, I don't, Peter or Geraldine, but I know that it really depends where the students come from and what level they're studying.
Quite a lot lower than I thought, that's all, when I looked at quite a lot lower.
Certainly, on that link between migration and coming to Australia, I think we've tried very hard to promote an experience in Australia that is about a high quality education experience and ensure that students get that and that they can take that back to the world. I mean, we're talking about that in the next session, frankly. But also there has been points made available for students taking a master's in Australia that contribute to permanent migration. So there is a link in the Australian system. And I think that post-study work rights, which we've given to students, and that 20-hour study that they can take while they're here, has always been that market advantage in Australia. And why do we know it's such a market advantage? Because the UK and Canada are seeking to copy it. And they're seeking to give more work rights and more post-study work rights to students than we have to become more attractive than Australia. Now, I'll tell you one thing, that we have better, you know, speeches and food and climate and, you know, lifestyle than the UK. I love Canada, but it is bloody cold. And so I'd love to see Australians come back. I'd love to see international students come back to Australia. So we've got to make sure that we continue to be an attractive destination. So there's a combination of a number of things for students. Firstly, we're a safe place. We've got relatively low levels of COVID, and one would hope that we have very, very, very low levels of COVID right across Australia, that those study opportunities are there for students, and that also that they can have a pathway by either home or to continue in Australia in a professional capacity. But I will say this as well, we've got a mission in the Australian higher education system as well in the TAFE system to service Australians, to make sure that they've got the qualifications they need and that they can move either from a disrupted state now in COVID back into work, or through short courses or retraining and upskilling into a new career. But also we, particularly at the ATN universities, we're helping small to medium enterprises right across the board revitalise themselves in a period of hibernation, move from that into developing new product ideas, engaging with new markets, understanding what the COVID disruption means to their businesses. So we've got a very important secondary role with small to medium and large enterprises, for that matter, to engage with them on those issues that we help support them. And we see that through internships with PhD students and undergraduates, working with their people that are running those businesses on those new ideas, how to maximise productivity and maximise markets. So we want to kind of revitalise the whole ecosystem in Australia so that Australians have opportunities to go into the workforce, that our businesses are revitalised, and of course that means that if that happens, there's lots of job opportunities for both Australians and of course international students.
Oh, just a small set of ambitions there. I think the figure is 27%. I think I've read that 27% of students, which is under a third, who do take up those working rights, which I was quite intrigued by that. I'm just going to go back to Jane. So Jane, did that ring true to you, what Luke was saying about the attitudes and Peter, for that matter, the attitudes of students to opportunities here to capitalise on their?
We certainly do see students seeing this as one of the, I guess, one of the benefits of choosing Australia as their study destination. But obviously, as that's been described earlier, we do notice a lot of students do leave the country post their study. And when we do have an option offer there, and we wanted to attract the most bright and talented students to stay and contribute to the economy of Australia, we should expect students, take on that path for themselves as a potential option for their future. So, and I think it's quite important to point out students invest a lot in their overseas education, and for the purpose of having a better life and better career. A lot of them go on and make contribution globally, and some of them do stay, and we manage to keep some very, very talented international students to stay in this country and make huge impact to our overall culture and the economy. So I think it's just quite important we acknowledge that. And also for our international students, at the moment, as we've pointed out, I know that Luke, you mentioned about the actual, we've done well in terms of introducing the post-study work rights, and now that obviously Canada and UK are following our suit, and then lately they've been very, very, very proactive in promoting the students. For example, again, just from a global perspective, the UK has just announced bringing forward their new streamlined student visa routes, they're called migration routes, bring that forward from January to October. That was announced about a week ago. So they're sending a very strong message. They want to keep the most bright and talented international students. So they're competing with us. You've got Canada, again, about a week or so before, just announced a further relaxation about their postgraduate work permit. That's what they call it. Again, that sends a very strong message out to the international students that they're there to support them, and that they're the commitment to those international students. I think we need to be very wary about what's happening around us as well, not just so much just to focus on Australia, because the students are, in the home country, they are comparing, they're comparing, and they are very tuned in to this policy changes. And
are they? That's your experience. They're tuned into these sorts of changes.
Oh, absolutely, Geraldine. According to our global platform, we see immediate shift in online search activity when they're big announcements. So Canada, when they announced their flexible post-study or postgraduate work permit, and that, we see huge spike in mid-May. US, obviously, we've seen a huge decline since May, and in that country, we usually see very stable web traffic in terms of inquiry for studying US, and we've seen a steady decline ever since the after the Bush protest. And then we've seen New Zealand, this dramatic spike in interest of going to New Zealand when the country announced coming out of the lockdown. And Australia, of course, the biggest spike for us was late July when we announced the flexible post-study work visa now. So students are actually tuning in, and they are, literally comparing.
Very, very interesting. Look, I've just got a few minutes. I suppose I wonder, whether in fact the yardstick will be, and I don't want to be political, but for the Prime Minister who sort of said you might consider to make your way home, do we need, earlier on, do we need an overt invitation to come back? I mean, what sort of atmospherics are going to have to exist to make sure that that cuts through? Just to answer, I'll go to each one of you on that question. To you first, Craig Robertson, given the sort of clearly the real, nuanced assessment being made by international students.
I think we need to be able to go back to our heritage as an open trading nation, and we've benefited immensely from that. And I think it'll be quite easy for the government to be able to say, we've benefited immensely from open borders and trade. Now that we think we've got our border controls coming in under control, it's now time to start thinking about opening up to the world again. And again, that fits with what John Hart was saying yesterday, because remember, we could have all the best post-study work rights here, but if it's going to be very costly in terms of getting a flight, they'll go to, if those routes are not open. So we need to sort of work in conjunction with business travel, tourist travel and student travel, and be part of that three-way part of opening the country up again.
Okay, and Taliessin Reaburn, I'm sorry I've left you out a little bit. You're South Australian. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I think, look, I think Australia's competitive position actually hasn't significantly changed yet. I know that other markets are really changing some of their policy levers. I think we still have a lot of advantages here that we do need to take advantage of once we can start to get those borders or that runway back to coming back to Australia open. We're lucky here. Our Premier and our politicians are very outspoken in support of the sector. They continue to lobby the federal government, as needed. One thing I just want to quickly just come back to something that Craig mentioned in regards to opening up a pilot program or return to smaller providers. And the universities currently being involved. Our pilot program is a low risk approach, and working with SA Health, the universities have the largest resources to bring to it. The aim of that is to develop efficiencies so that we can create a lower risk approach for smaller providers, so they don't have to put in as much, both financial and time resources as it opens up. So that is definitely the aim, Craig, and we're briefing all of our providers regularly on that and working with them for the next phase once the borders do start to open up. So I just want to reassure people that, this is not a one part of the sector program. This is for the whole sector. And I think if we leave any elements of the sector out, those historical pathways between schools, between foundation programs, between ELICOS into the higher ed sector will collapse. And that would be more damaging, I think, than some of the things that are currently happening now. But Geraldine, always fantastic to have a Prime Minister who comes out in support of international students. We would love to see that every day of the week. So let's see if we can find some good platforms for him to make those announcements.
Right, thank you. Peter, what are your thoughts on this?
Look, just briefly, Geraldine, because I know we're short of time, I think we've got to do a better job of communicating to the Australian public about the benefits of international education. And I don't just mean the economic benefits, and I don't just mean our political leaders, I mean our business leaders as well. I think we've got to help the community see the enormous soft power that we're generating internationally by engaging, supporting, welcoming, embracing international students, particularly at a time like now. So I think if we can do that, particularly once borders reopen and, at a time when unemployment's going to be high, realising that this is a sector that supports 250,000 jobs. It's a sector that contributes enormously to the fabric of the country. So if we can get those sorts of messages out, I think we'll be doing well.
And a quick final word to you, Luke.
Well, I wouldn't want us to lose in the arms race between the UK, Canada and New Zealand and the US. I think Australia is the #1 destination for many, many students in the English-speaking world. We should keep that up, but we need a new coalition and a new conversation to start that coalition. That's why we're here talking to small business owners, people that benefit from international students and the investment that they bring, and of course, that while they're here, they are part of our family. So we want to see not just education providers talk about the importance of international education, but people from regional Australia that run small businesses, hospitality, pubs, clubs, hotels saying, come back to Australia, we're safe, we're warm and we're welcoming.
Okay, now I'm going to Jane, take that last remark of yours, which was so interesting, as your final remark. So, look, thank you. I think it's been very, very interesting. And I want to thank Peter Mackey, Jane Lee, Luke, and Taliessin Reaburn from South Australia, and Craig Robertson. Thank you all very much indeed.
Thanks, Geraldine.
And
thanks, Geraldine. Thanks, everyone.
Soft power and other things coming up next, international education at a time of geopolitical tension, after a short break. Thanks.
My first impression of Perth is it's a really beautiful place, and the people over here are so good, they are so friendly. I'm loving this place completely.
I love the university. University is my favorite part.
I must say professors here are highly qualified in the campus.
They have much more on-hand experience in the market. They were giving real-time experiences and examples and good future advice. Virtual campus is something I found very interesting. It's a brilliant campus for all the students with all the culture. Like, I find everyone over there, like any culture you go, you have there. And it's a brilliant campus for all the students to explore. When it comes to other kind of pedagogies, somewhere students' involvement gets less, whereas your students are into learning something. That makes the difference, and that is the biggest, appreciating thing about Curtin's pedagogy.
I will surely come here for my further studies. Yep.
I'm looking forward to study in the campus, as it's going to be a great experience for me.
Right, we're back. Excellent. Look, thank you very much indeed. I'm just gathering my papers together because I'm very much looking forward. I mean, I'm looking forward to all of the sessions, but I'm looking forward to this one, International Education in a Time of Geopolitical Tension, because we're blessed today to be able to welcome 3 people who have real experience in this somewhat arcane area in some ways of international affairs and foreign policy, although I have always believed it has very real world day-to-day relevance, and it turns out to be vital, as we just alluded to in that last conversation around soft power when considering this related question of international education. Because it is a bit character building, can I use that term right now? Trying to position Australia broadly, let alone in a big export market like education amidst such volatility. Not really seen since the end of World War II. I don't think that's hyperbole for once. We have a highly significant US election coming up very shortly. We're seeing relations between us and the Chinese regime become publicly hostile, and where this goes next is truly critical for Australia. We've seen Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe resign, and therefore a whole new administration enter the picture. We're seeing India grapple with its paradoxes, to say the least, and quite where that heads is tricky, shall we say. And as we heard yesterday from Ted Baillieu, I thought it was very interesting, the former Premier, we are seeing phenomenal developments and aspirations in Africa, he reminded us with one of his slides, which we really have only barely begun to grasp. That's just a whole new area, which I thought was very provocative, very thought-provoking. So I could go on, but I won't. I'll stop and defer to our guests. Let me pose the question, though, that I will put to all of them. How much is international education caught up in the power plays underway at the moment between a range of countries? Because I think that is the key thing. You know, we could diagnose to bilio all the things that you see in the headlines, but it's really how much it affects international education. It'll blur, I know, between all of these issues. But I'm first delighted to introduce Alexander Downer, who was Australia's longest serving foreign minister and most recently Australian High Commissioner to the UK. His column in the AFR every Monday morning, I think, is pretty required reading. And he has a disturbing tendency to agree with me on the drum whenever we're on. This is something that is...
Why is that disturbing?
Quite disturbing. Now, so Alexander, welcome. And look,
Thanks, Geraldine.
How do you think international education gets caught up in this?
Well, there's obviously the specific issue of Chinese students and the impact potentially once the COVID restrictions are lifted, in particular, the impact that various statements that particularly the ambassador and his statements would obviously be authorised out of Beijing have made about Australia not being a friendly country and so on. My guess is that won't have much impact at all, that there will continue to be very substantial demand from China, from Chinese families, particularly richer families, for education in Western countries. I work at King's College London now, which obviously has experienced the lockdown experiences of other universities in Australia, and not quite as rigorous actually. But the demand in the UK from Chinese students as the new academic year is just beginning now is still very, very substantial. And I think that will continue to be reflected in Australia, and Australian universities have a very strong reputation internationally. So I don't think in that sense geopolitics is going to be a huge issue unless the Australian government itself starts introducing some restrictions on students from different countries, including China, and I can't see that happening, frankly, and nor would it make any sense.
So just the tone, for instance, so you obviously see that there is a distinction between the sort of, can you hear happily? Right.
Yes, I can, yeah.
Between the tone of the political discussion and the sorts of decisions that they're making. Like, I noticed that I was just looking at something from the Fin Review of the 31st of August, trying to discern this as well. And, you know, the Global Times, which is very hawkish and so on, the sort of thing, the most famous quote from Hu Zhijin, the controversial editor of Global Times, who said, "Australia is always there making trouble. It's a bit like chewing gum, stuck on the sole of China's shoes. Sometimes you have to find a stone to rub it off." Now, I know Global Times is not the government, but you think that families and students can distinguish that sort of rhetoric, do you?
Yes, I mean, it's a great question. And well, I think you have to, yes, the Global Times isn't the government, but it does reflect what the harder edges of the government might be thinking. So you have at least to read it and think about it. Yeah, I mean, they obviously, and you've seen it from the statements of the ambassador, the Chinese ambassador in Canberra, there is anger on their part. We may say unjustified anger, but it is as it is. There is anger with Australia at the level of the government. But my experience, which is sort of reasonably limited, but my experience is of the students themselves and the funders of the students, who are often the parents of the students, not always, but often the parents of the students, is that they continue to want high quality education. That is hugely important to those families, obviously to the students themselves. And Australia does offer that, and Australia offers it at a pretty good price. I know a bit about the pricing because in the UK. I know what universities over here charge. So no, I'm not too pessimistic about it. I think that students from China will continue to come, and obviously it's not relevant to other countries. And I think you know, markets like India are going to be ever growing in importance for Australian universities as they are in the UK.
Okay. Now, Senator Penny Wong is also with us, the shadow leader, the shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs, leader of the opposition in the Senate, and of course very much with a multicultural background herself, which she's written about, I think, very interestingly. Penny Wong, how do you think the international education gets caught up in these tensions or not?
Good to be with you, Geraldine, and hello to Alexander and to Stephen. It's good to share a screen with you. I think there are a couple of separate dynamics which are both at work here in the context of international education. The first is geopolitics, and the second is where the global economy is and relevant economies in terms of our market. In terms of the first, I hope Alexander's right, but I have a sense that we are in a different phase in our relationship with China. And I spoke about this actually prior to the pandemic, and my view has become stronger since. And an element of that new phase is the willingness of the Chinese Communist Party to integrate economic dynamics and economic policies with its own geopolitical strategy. So it is, I think it's not the case that we can say with a great deal of confidence that the distinction which might have existed between what occurred between nations and decisions from Chinese consumers, I don't think we can say with great confidence and certainty that will remain. I hope it will, given where the relationship is at. But I think we will see how that plays out. Certainly comments have been made. I'm less concerned about the Global Times than the comments of the ambassador that Alexander referred to. And it was quite clear in that a number of industries and sectors were mentioned, of which education is one. The second dynamic is obviously where the global economy is. And the reality is that a number of alternative markets are experiencing very substantial downturns. The Indian economy has taken a very big hit. Certainly a lot of Southeast Asian economies, Malaysia had a 17% contraction in the last GDP figures. So that does mean, as a market that is dependent on consumer demand, and consumer demand is connected to how the economic well-being of the home countries, that places a great deal of pressure on Australia. The point I think I would make is we're going through an unprecedented period in human history, and largest global downturn since Great Depression, and a period of strategic competition that's not been seen since really World War II. I think how we transition out of this is, a big question and a work in progress. And my instinct, and it's probably not what your audience wants to hear, is that I doubt that the new normal will be like the old normal. I suspect we will have quite a different dynamic, quite a different set of geopolitical and market conditions. And I suspect that the way in which we relied on the large numbers of international students may have to be rethought. And certainly we will have to think about, if we are serious about this market, and it's such an important market for Australia, such important financial as well as cultural contribution, we're going to have to do better than telling people to go home, which is what happened earlier this year. So I think we will have a bit of work to do.
Okay, I'll come back to that. And Stephen Smith's joining us as well. I'm delighted to say he was, of course, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Minister for Trade, Minister for Defence in the Rudd and Gillard governments, and now enjoying life in Perth, my hometown. So, Stephen, welcome.
Thanks, Geraldine. Good to speak to you again, and good to share a platform with Alexander and Penny.
Indeed. Now, how do you see this?
Well, in terms of the risk equation when it comes to China, I'm more in Penny's camp than I am in Alexander's. I think our relationship with China will get worse before it gets better. I think that the areas of the economy and industry which the ambassador drew attention to in the last few months, the Chinese have been going through those and ticking the box. So it wouldn't surprise me that when Australia is in a position, both Commonwealth and state governments and universities, to receive overseas students again, that we don't have the same mix of students from China coming. So that's the, if you like, the global or the foreign relations point. On the economic point, it is, I think, a matter of deep regret for us that at the same time as the pandemic, we've seen great economies from whom we should be looking to a greater influx of students, both in the past and now, in particular India and Indonesia, are of course suffering deeply in a health sense, but also deeply in an economic sense. And so something that we should have been doing for the last half dozen years, namely trying to diversify our student intake, not to be so dependent upon China, but to spread into India and to Indonesia and ASEAN economies. Economically, that may not be as attractive a proposition in the short term as it was before the pandemic. Having said that, I share, in a sense, Alexander's optimism that there will always be families overseas in those countries that we've mentioned who want their children to either have their undergraduate or postgraduate education in another country. And in this area, you know, we are world class and we are very competitive, both with the United States and the United Kingdom. So there will still be families, whether they're from China, India or Indonesia, who want to send their children to Australia to study. So we'll still continue to see students come. What the ultimate mix is, time will tell. But I also agree with Penny's point, which is how universities and the tertiary education sector emerges from this period. It's not like, it is not going to be what it was before. And so there are a whole range of fundamental questions that universities need to be considering in terms of funding, in terms of capacity to do research and capacity to do teaching. And not all of those problems will be solved or addressed by ongoing international students coming to our shores.
Oh, well, that's very interesting. And let me just take you up then. If they are to emerge into this next stage and speak differently, straight into the hearts and minds of the households making those decisions, past the politics, how would you do that? I mean, this is very difficult. How do you, I mean, obviously that's what the IDP, as we were talking about last session, how do you actually get through to people that there are a range of conversations held, which are parallel conversations, you know, I mean, I think that's what you're saying.
Well, in terms of China, if the Chinese authorities determine that Chinese students shouldn't come to Australia either at undergraduate or postgraduate level, then no individual Chinese family is going to be able to move outside that. In terms of other potential markets, India, Indonesia, other ASEAN countries, indeed some European countries, most of the universities who have engaged in international student markets have direct voices in those countries. They either have representatives there on the ground, campuses on the ground, or they have agents there. And that, I think that will continue, although economic constraints may cause universities across the board to restrict those direct approaches that they're making. But there will always be families, and the higher up the socio-economic ladder you are, the more likely it is, who will want their children to benefit from an overseas student experience. That's been good for young Australians historically. Historically, you would go to the United Kingdom or the United States to study. Now that's much, particularly postgraduate, that's much more broadly based now into North and South and Southeast Asia. And the reverse is true of other countries. Australia has always been an attractive destination for ASEAN countries, in the modern era, an attractive destination for Chinese students. And our fastest growing student intake until the arise of the pandemic were Indian students, which from a whole range of reasons is an unambiguously good thing.
Well, in fact, I've just got the statistics. Students come from 204 countries. Top source countries: China, 28%, India, 15%, Nepal, 7%, Brazil, 4%, Vietnam, Malaysia and South Korea all at 3%. And in December 2019, there was 758,154 international students, which was up 9% compared with December 2018. So that just gives us a little, I think that's very interesting. Penny Wong, if this new normal, you know, Stephen clearly believes economics, from what, if I'm reading him correctly, is going to play as probably a bigger role than politics, which I'm quite intrigued to hear. Do you think that? I mean, in other words, all this talk, the talk and the language is so strident these days. Maybe it doesn't matter.
Well, I think I presume you're referencing the relationship with China. I think what we say always matters. And that's why we should be very clear about what we are saying, and why we should be careful about what we are saying, and why leadership in terms of Australia's position from the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister is so important. We've done a lot of talking about China, less talking with China than what we should. Some of that is obviously beyond the government's control, as obviously, you know, minister-to-minister relations have broken down. My view is, when you have a relationship that you know is difficult, that you know is challenging, that you know the two parties do have different views on certain issues, which are not going to change. We're not going to change our position on the international law of the sea. We're not going to change our position on human rights, our view about Hong Kong, etc., a view about the Uyghurs. These and many other things are things that Australia is not going to shift position on. And so where you know there are structurally conflicts in the relationship because of fundamental differences of view, I think it calls for a degree of consistency and discipline and care in how we handle our public language. Because I do think, as Stephen said, he was, you know, right about the economics, but he also made the point that ultimately, if the Chinese authorities make a certain decision, it doesn't matter how much marketing we do. Having said that, if I can come back to where I started, which is, you know, where will the new normal be? I do think we can send a very clear message, both in terms of our bilateral relationship, but also our broader position around, you know, how we value this, how we value this market, how we value international students, and having governments support the recovery process through how it is people come back to Australia, how states and institutions are supported as the borders gradually open up. Now, that would be, I think, a sensible thing, both from the support to the sector perspective, but also because it does send a very clear message about an important aspect of the bilateral relationship, which works to the benefit of both nations.
And you think you can do that? It's sort of like walk and chew gum at the same time.
Oh, no, I never think anything in relation to China at the moment is easy. I think there's a lot of people who say, oh, we can do this better, but it is challenging. I mean, I think, you know, we ought not pretend, but it's, you know, both the foreign ministers who are on the call would say there are always challenging aspects to every bilateral relationship. So that's not new. I think we are in a new phase in our relationship with China, and that is as a function of many things. It's obviously more assertive, and then the different role it sees for itself in the world and the way it's asserting that. So, and on some issues we share views, and on other issues we have fundamental differences, and so we have to navigate that sensibly.
Alexander Downer, you can send a message of welcoming, can you? If you're a foreign minister or a prime minister, welcoming people from the area, from a country whose overall policies you're a bit ambivalent about, you can do that?
Yes, I mean, the individual students are, of course, very welcome. I mean, to suggest to them that because of the behaviour of their government, and the Chinese government, the Communist Party, has decided under Xi Jinping's leadership to take a much more aggressive approach towards Western countries. They've completely changed the more traditional position they had under Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao. Well, that's one thing, but the relationship with the individual people, we have to distinguish between the hostility of the government and the attitude to the people of China. I just want to make one other point too, which is that I have some experience, as I mentioned earlier, of what's been happening in the UK, whose relationship with China, like other Western countries, has deteriorated. There's been slanging matches with them over Hong Kong, the Uyghurs, and importantly, dare I say it, over Huawei and the like. And the Chinese ambassador in London has been making the rather familiar blood-curdling sounds about the impact this will have, and the British will be punished and so on. But I work in a university here, and we're just now at the beginning of the new academic year, which starts in September, October in the UK. And what has surprised me, even in spite of the huge economic downturns, but that's of course not peculiar to Australia. It's not so great in Australia as it is in, as Penny was saying, in relation to Malaysia, but many other countries. In spite of all of that, I have been amazed at the high level of enrolments that have just continued in British universities from inter alia China. They're growing from India and so on. And I do think this reflects a much deeper thought than just the ephemeral. And that is, goes back to what I said before, that first of all, there is a huge demand amongst a growing middle class in China, but in India and in Southeast Asia and elsewhere, parts of Africa, of course, Nigeria and the like. There is a huge demand for top quality education and in the English language. One of the reasons why Australia does incredibly well in terms of tertiary foreign students in tertiary institutions is partly because they're high quality, and it is partly because it is in English. So we have many more foreign students than countries like France and Germany, and they have excellent universities in France and Germany. So I think that demand, you know, there might be a blip in it because of the COVID-19 downturn, but unless you think that's permanent, I mean, I don't think that downturn is permanent. I think, unfortunately, it's going to last a bit longer than many people think, but I don't think it's permanent. I think we have every reason to be optimistic, and unless we do something, you know, some act of self-harm to our universities or with our universities, and I don't see any sign of that, then I think we can look positively to the future. And certainly, as I said, I really want to emphasize this. The experience we have in the UK in universities just very recently has been that foreign demand still remains very strong.
Yes, China doesn't yet have the educational capacity, does it really, to meet these sorts of demands, but it might in the future, might it not?
They will, and actually I wouldn't underestimate the quality of some of the Chinese universities. I mean, you know, Peking universities are very, now a very renowned university. If you look at the top 100 universities in the world, there are 2 or 3 of them which are in China. So, and their government, understandably, is investing very heavily in their universities. But having said that, that doesn't mean there won't continue to be substantial demand from China because of the advantages of studying in English, developing networks in other countries where people, for right or for wrong, middle-class people in countries, not just in China, but in other countries in Asia and Africa, they judge that they will get ahead faster and more successfully in a globalized economy if they're educated in prestigious universities outside of their own country. And that is going to continue to drive demand for a long time. I mean, I wouldn't get too pessimistic. Think how terrible the relationship between China and the United States has been. But, you know, Harvard and Yale and MIT and Stanford and so on, they're not reeling from a collapse in foreign students in spite of all of that.
They're bigger brands though, aren't they?
Well, they are bigger brands. They're the biggest brands, and Oxford and Cambridge and so on. They are the biggest brands. But let's not play ourselves down here. I think Australian universities actually, by the way, are very big brands. And particularly the Group of 8, but not just, come from Adelaide, so I don't want to discount Flinders
Certainly
and the
not.
University of South Australia.
We have
But
hosted by the disruptors.
Indeed. I mean, they have done a fantastic job, by the way,
they have.
an extraordinary job. But they, the group of 8, I was only going to say of them that they are very well known around the world. And their academics are interacting the whole time with academics from other major institutions. So let's not play them down. I think they're very good brands.
I just wonder, Stephen Smith, whether, I mean, my judgment is, and just based on the texts I get at the ABC when we cover the story of China, broadly described, there is a disturbing development in what I'd call barely above yellow peril attitudes, to be candid, that has started to seep into the population as this has become a bit more overtly bitter. And that sense, look, you know, it's one part of it. I'm not accepting, I'm not saying this is typical of a wide Australian attitude, but that sort of sense of, oh, you know, we can't trust the Chinese, they're infiltrating in all sorts of ways to our lives. And I might add, this sort of conversation is prompted by various outlets based in the national capital, or, you know, nothing straightforward. That's what nothing straightforward. They're coming in their unusual ways, and the universities get taken into this. Now, I mean, how would you counter that type of temperamental style, which I think is really there?
Well, I think in the first instance, you have to be quite frank and straightforward and honest about the fact that the China we're dealing with now is not the China that we dealt with for most of the years from 1972 on, when we gave them early recognition with the One China policy. And the change clearly came with Xi Jinping, and it came, you could see the emerging signs of it in 2013, but really by 2014, 2015, you're dealing with a changed China, a much more assertive, aggressive China, and a China who essentially says, if we have a subject matter which we determine is a core Chinese interest, then we won't brook a conversation, let alone any negotiation. So if we identify an issue, we make our mind up and we won't countenance a conversation. So that's the China we're dealing with now. But like any country, China is not a monolith. And so it doesn't make any sense for us to say, because that's the approach of the Xi Jinping administration and the Communist Party of China, we should cut all ties, not have conversations, not encourage their individuals to come here to trade or to go to universities or whatever. Of course we shouldn't. It's not a monolith. And we should continue to engage as we have since the early 1970s, where our ambition was to draw China out into the global world, global economy as what we used to call in those days a responsible stakeholder. Now we have very grave reservations and pessimism and clear sight of the fact that we don't believe China is conducting itself as a responsible stakeholder. So I think we've got to be clear-sighted about that. That's why if China decides for, if you like, economic punishment reasons that Chinese students can't come to Australia or shouldn't come to Australia, that'll be the end of the matter. At the same time, we should continue to be doing everything we can to trade with China, to have decent civil and cordial relations to the extent that we can within that parameter I've outlined. But having said all of that, even in the good times, both universities, our overall trade, our overall economic relationships, we had too many eggs in the China basket, and we needed to engage in what I describe as project diversification some years ago. And so you now find with international students, over-reliant upon overseas students for income, and within that basket, heavily reliant upon Chinese students. So a lesson here is, if you're a company or a country or an organisation and you're overcommitted in one particular area, you've got to try and diversify in the good times, because when the bad time comes, you'll then have to do it in a mad scramble. So I think project diversification for universities is very, very important. And that then leads us to the countries that you have referred to, and Penny and I and Alexander have mentioned. But I must say, I'm buoyed by Alexander's personal experience that they continue to come to the United Kingdom, because Families and countries and students who've looked to the UK have also traditionally looked to the US and Australia. And if we're competitive in that market, then we will continue to see this as being an attractive and essential part, not just of our university sector, but of our economy more generally.
Yeah, it is very interesting. And I wonder, Penny Wong, I suppose what I'm really getting at is how do we cultivate an attitude of trust towards international students coming from China, obviously, you know, not from other areas, when the language at the moment around the regime is so much the reverse of that. So that seems to me to be something terribly important for university authorities to work out how they do this.
Well, you used a very important word when you first asked Stephen the question about this, which was temperament. And I think that does matter. I mean, we you know, how we talk and what we say, how we say it does matter. I'd first start with the point that you raised about, you know, prejudice, discrimination. You used the term yellow peril. You know, my parents married when the White Australia policy was still in place, so we're not that long from a period that we have collectively moved past. But we must always stand up against racism and prejudice. We also have to recognise, you know, China's a great power and it's doing what great powers do, which is to assert its interests, and some of those interests are not Australia's interests, and we are clear about that. You know, we need to safeguard our sovereignty. We need to ensure our institutions, including our universities, are resilient. I think what that means is we have to articulate clearly our view and our position on certain issues. We have to articulate it clearly, calmly and consistently. And we do need to avoid a sort of hairy-chested escalation, which is generally engaged in by, you know, mostly backbenchers who are playing to a domestic audience. And I don't think that helps the tone of the discussion when you've already got some pretty substantial differences that you have to navigate, that, you know, whoever's in government, certainly the current government, is having to navigate. I don't think engaging in a domestic political escalation is helpful. We also do need to support universities to ensure they have the tools to manage some of the issues which have been raised. Obviously, foreign interference has been discussed recently. The government set up a universities foreign interference task force, which, you know, I hope is supposed to be able to give much more granular support, advice, assistance to universities in making the judgments around collaboration. You know, I agree with both Alexander and Stephen, and that's terrifying, I suppose, in some ways, but that we want to keep engaging, and we want to keep engaging China. We want to keep engaging with them in terms of this market and more generally, notwithstanding the differences. And we have to have the wherewithal to be able to manage that engagement and to ensure that our institutions are sufficiently resourced, both financially but also intellectually, to ensure they are resilient and they are able to manage this.
It's interesting that the universities, I think it was about, I don't know, 4 months ago or something or other, said about the business of assessing whether people represented a security risk. And they said, you know, we've had committees, several of them said, particularly Sydney, Melbourne, we've had committees assessing this when people put up proposals, particularly for graduate work, particularly when it related to defence in South Australia and so on and so forth. We've had all our committees. We think they virtually said, we think we're very skilled and competent at assessing risk. I don't think anybody heard it. You know, I sort of thought the universities feel they're well ahead of the general conversation, but the general conversation was moving in such a fearful way about relationships, particularly with China, that it sounded as if the universities had been sort of mugs, just accepting anything that was coming, any collaborative money, any joint venture money. It was just a very interesting moment for me anyway, looking on, because I just find that the volatility and attitudes on behalf of the Australian people, my reading of it is that it's very soft at the moment, trying to work out who's got their act together about all this. And I mean, I'll just go a little bit. I suppose I'm looking for people in foreign affairs and in prime ministerial fluency and so on, to sort of say, look, we think we have got a new environment, but my God, we think our education facilities are just crackerjack, you know, and we want to welcome people. I mean, it's that sort of two-handed approach that surely is what international education needs.
Well, it's what engagement needs, isn't it? I mean, unless we decide that we're, and nobody's suggesting that, unless we decide we're a country that doesn't actually want to engage with other nations, which is not a proposition that has any merit, then, you know, by necessity, governments have to demonstrate that leadership, which is we have X, Y, and Z differences. However, you know, these relationships, this engagement is important to us. This is how we will facilitate it. This is how we will support it. This is how we will resource it.
Yeah. Okay. Alexander, I mean, I just wonder how the debate is in the UK, given that you like observing these things. That sort of double-handed thing that I'm espousing, do you hear that?
Well, there are two things here. There are what are the universities saying, and what does the government say? So the media focuses on what the government says. So what a minister says, or even, I mean, I don't think what a backbencher says, sadly, perhaps, but it doesn't amount to much. And governments don't take that terribly seriously. But what ministers say and what the Prime Minister or the President says, other governments focus very seriously on that. But remember that universities have their own networks into these countries which are important markets for them. Don't forget that. So the relationships with not just the vice chancellors and, you know, deputy vice chancellors, provosts and so on, but academics further down the line are pretty sophisticated and pretty developed relationships. And also universities use different techniques to attract students in different countries. And so if it's a particular university, it needs to be sending out a particular message of welcome, that courses are available, students from, let's just focus here on China, students from China are very welcome. There's no doubt about that. And I would say to you, it's never going to make a media story. But so much of what happens in this world is not a media story, and yet a lot of it is important.
Yes.
And those more granular relationships between universities and their markets are very, very important.
And you think the point is you think they're still very healthy?
Yeah, I think in a lot of cases they're very, I mean, people know each other. I mean, one of the pieces of experience that I and Penny and Stephen can bring to this discussion is the importance of personal relationships when dealing in Asia in particular. It's very dangerous to generalize about Asia, but one observation I would make is if you build a strong personal relationship, they are very loyal friends, but you have to build the personal relationships. And a lot of our universities have been excellent at building those personal relationships. That's interesting. And they will help sustain those relationships through this difficult time. And there's no walking away from the devastating impact on everybody's economy of COVID-19. There's no walking away from that. And of course, in Australia's case, there are these extraordinary restrictions on being able to re-enter to enter the country, having spent 2 weeks in a hotel. I know they're terribly popular, so dare one ever criticize it. But anyway, doesn't make it any easier. The more horrible the restriction, the more popular it seems to be. I just want to, however, so not supporting the Australian people on that, but to support the Australian people in this way, following on the conversation you've been having. And that is the government in Beijing needs to stop and think about the impact it is having on public opinion in many Western countries. And if you look at the polls, if they're to be believed, there has been a huge shift in sentiment in Australia towards China over the last, 2 or 3, I think perhaps only 2 or 3, perhaps 3 or 4 years. Away from China, a real loss of trust of China. And I mean, whatever the convenient political points might be to make about that, the truth is the Chinese government needs to reflect on this and how it's not just governments that it's getting offside, but it's getting a broader public in Western countries offside.
They don't seem to care about that, Alexander. They don't seem to care. I mean, this is blind.
Not this day. Not this day. They don't. Well, Xi Jinping doesn't seem to care about it. My advice is there are plenty of people who care about it, but you know, if you raised a concern about it with Xi Jinping, you'd find yourself facing corruption charges and be put in jail.
No, look, I mean, that's a work in progress. That I couldn't agree with you more, and I'd love to be able to have a genuine sort of eagle-eyed view on the elites, the way they're discussing it. It seems to me. And before I want to move to soft and hard power. How do you feel about this business, about the tone, and just particularly the dilemma facing universities?
The tone, you're talking to me?
No, I'm talking to Stephen. Sorry, Stephen.
Sorry. Well, look, you spoke earlier, Geraldine, about universities saying, look, we've become very good at managing risk. Well, there's a bit of a lag effect here, which is it's one thing to manage risk when the relationship with China is going well. It's another thing to manage risk in the current environment, particularly when you have the overlay of foreign interference legislation and you have the overlay of universities now required, and in my view it's a good thing, to work much more closely with Commonwealth authorities as this risk is managed. But I think Penny and Alexander are in screaming agreement, which is we have to continue to talk to China. China is not, as I said earlier, a monolith, so there's no point not having those conversations. And universities obviously can be part of it, but my worry is that if the Chinese authorities decide that that's it for Australia and Chinese students, well, then that will be the end of the matter, irrespective of what dissenting voice occurs either quietly in China or robustly in Australia. On the changed mood, I think Alexander's made a very good point. That change of mood has been quite swift. In 2014-15, the country and the leadership that Australians were most concerned about, if you looked at the Lowy Institute's of annual research, was Donald Trump and the United States. The latest Lowy research, which was published earlier this year, had, I think, two compelling features. One was that the mood and the sentiment about China had changed dramatically and was far and away the country that Australians trusted least. But also, I think, presciently, 94% of the Australian public in the Lowy survey said the time has now come for us to diversify. And this is the Australian public getting to an economic position in advance of universities, but also in advance of the Australian business community. One of the things which continues to interest me is that in the United States, one of the great supporters of China's engagement economically was the America-China Business Foundation. Last time I was in the United States last year, the secretary of the American-China Business Association said that 80% of his members would no longer deal with China at all or speak to them because of contract disputes and IP theft. The Australian business community has taken a much longer period of time to appreciate that the China we're dealing with now is a changed China. That's not to say that they should pick up stumps and walk away, but when governments see things through the eyes of national economic and national security interests, they have to see things through the China that they're currently dealing with. And that's not easy and it's not difficult. And governments can't afford to have that lag effect in play, which is we're no longer dealing with a once responsible stakeholder, we're dealing with a different beast.
Yeah, I think it's also true that, you know, a little while ago, the Americans developed this bipartisan attitude to China, which I think meant that no one could deal with China there. I don't know whether that's in their national interest either. I mean, you know, I think that's a very rich debate. And actually, I find the Australian business community's discussions and sort of the efforts to actually maintain open links, similar to what Alexander was saying, sort of back channels with the universities. I find that quite refreshing, actually. But I know that that's, debate. Look, we've got 10 minutes to go. There is an argument that, in a way, international education needs to be lifted to a perceived higher moral purpose in order to sort of think more broadly about connecting international education with our diplomatic and aid objectives. And this is, I think, a sort of a tricky one, and it goes to those questions of hard and soft power. Now, I wonder whether I'd always considered international education was part of our soft power, but it just seems to me to be struggling in that realm a little bit at the moment when hard power starts to really rattle the cage. And I just wonder how you all think that through, that, you know, it's always a tricky dance between perceived hard and soft power. A lot of people don't even understand what that means. It's a bit blurry. But I think it's probably an important thing for international education to debate out loud. How have you seen it work, Alexander? How do you think of jostling the two?
Well, I think soft power, the expression soft power really is a shorthand way of talking about your influence and your reputation in the world. And if you look at soft power indices, I'm not sure how scientific they are, but they're published from time to time. You'll find Australia consistently in the top 10 countries in the whole world in terms of soft power. So from where do we derive our soft power? Goes back to something I said before, never underestimate this. One of them is language. We happen to be lucky enough to speak the global language as our first language. But our universities are a huge part of our soft power in two ways. One, we have a reputation for top-level universities. A degree from an Australian university is really worth something. And so that gives us a certain cachet, a certain status. But I found as the foreign minister, and I guess Stephen and Penny would have found this in their different capacities as well, that as you go particularly around Asia, you come across people in powerful positions, be they in business, in the professions and in politics, who have been to Australian universities and who have a huge affection for Australia coming out of that.
Mahathir accepted.
Mahathir didn't go to an Australian university, though. He went to
okay.
No, he didn't. He went to a Malaysian university.
Okay.
No, poor old Dr. Mahathir didn't know. But there are Malaysians who have. And I always found this a great bond with people in different kinds of positions in Asia. So I think Australia derives, and I'm not talking about people in politics. Some of them are in the media, but in business, a lot of very important business people have been educated in Australia. I just think it's priceless. When you have a big alumni event, an Australian alumni event in, you know, wherever it is, in Singapore or Kuala Lumpur or in Hong Kong or somewhere, it's just a sight to behold, and is a very, very strong statement about the soft power, if you like, the influence and the reputation of Australia. I don't want to be too upbeat because normally we have to criticize everything. But personally, I think it's a great tribute to our country. It's incredible the way we have built that reputation. It's, you know, nothing to do with Liberal and Labor. They've both of our major political parties have always formed government, and they've always pushed this pretty hard.
But that's what's so extraordinary, that it is, I agree with you, this pride is there, and it's an incredible achievement, which is why it was a surprise this year to see it somehow, I don't know, treated as something that was lay-asideable.
It's not lay-asideable. No, we have to, this has to continue to be a very major part of our national agenda. I mean, you'll have heard in this conference all the data on the economic importance of of students to the Australian economy, and that is, as it is, our third or fourth biggest export earner. But that's important, obviously. But in terms of our standing in the world, in terms of our influence, in terms of us being able to project the good things about our values, what we stand for, education is and students studying in Australia is absolutely critical to that. It is one of the single most important things that we do in terms of our reputation in the world.
Penny Wong?
I agree with that. My father was a Colombo Plan scholar from Malaysia. Yes, that's how we met my mum at Adelaide Uni. And I grew up in a town in Malaysia with a whole cohort of civil and political leaders who were Colombo Plan scholars. In fact, I remember one point going back after we'd come back here, Dad was still there, and I think it was the Chief Minister, the Attorney General, the Police Chief and the Chief Justice were all Colombo Plan scholars. So I mean, I think things have shifted a little bit now, but my point, Alexander's right, if you go to, and I have been to quite a few as a daughter of a Colombo Plan scholar, you get invited when you're in Malaysia to these various alumni meetings or events, and it is extraordinary. So yes, it is a sector which is so important, industry, or a sector which is so important to us economically, but it is priceless in terms of the markers of soft power, reputation and influence, personal connection, capital, cultural capital, understanding towards Australia. And if I would say, in a world which we are living in now, which is a world which I think is less stable, probably more divided, and has more risk than in previous decades for Australia, a focal point of competition between the great powers in our region. I reckon we need as much soft power as we can, and it's a pretty good thing to have those sorts of connections with people who go back to their home countries with a positive view about our country and a deeper understanding of our country and our political system. So it is a reputation we have to safeguard, and it is a sector we have to continue to support, not just for the economic reasons, but because of the enormous dividend it yields in terms of our place in and influence in the world.
I'll give final remarks to Stephen Smith on this.
Well, I strongly agree with the sentiments expressed both by Alexander and Penny. The Colombo Plan, for example, I think is one of the finest things Australia has done historically. Whether overseas students or researchers come here as part of a formal Commonwealth program like the Colombo Plan, or they come to Australia as a student at a particular university, when they return home, the almost universal, unambiguous result is that they become ambassadors for Australia for the rest of their lives. And so the influence that gives us in those countries, the friendships that develops, the advantage that it gives us is just unlimited, and as Penny says, it's priceless. So I think, as Alexander says, there'll be no media as a result of the three of us being in screaming agreement, but that's one of the most important fundamentals of Australian foreign policy and external application, and long may it continue.
Will you tell the security establishment that when you get the chance? She says, bit of editorialising there, which we won't comment on. Look, I really have found that, very stirring, actually, very stirring. And I really want to thank Alexander Downer, Penny Wong and Stephen Smith. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
A pleasure.
So look, thank you everybody for being with us. I think that's been a lovely mix again. Tomorrow we're going to particularly look at the experience of the student experience in Australia, and whether this is something that this disruptive time is going to force us to reconsider, to absolutely jolt us out of any complacency, and whether the student experience, notwithstanding what we just heard then, needs to be rethought, and maybe that is so. So we're back here at the same time tomorrow for our final two sessions, but thank you for your time today, and go forth and praise Australian education. Bye-bye.